All right, everybody, my name is Jeffrey Booth, and I am here for the Stories for My Lights YouTube channel. Yes, the most fascinating, amazing YouTube channel to ever grace this entire world, universe, perhaps even multiverse, or multiverse of multiverses, depending on how fractal and deep the universe truly is. Now, as you may know, we recently finished up the first part of the Craig saga, which will expand into other stories in the future. But today, I'm feeling like telling a complete random story. I think this story is going to be about the most innocent of things, the most calm of things, gentle, and totally not conducive to a story of epic proportions. An amethyst crystal. Once upon a time, there was a boy named Marcus. And you see, Marcus loved rocks. He didn't just like rocks. He didn't just enjoy going to a rock shop from time to time. He was obsessed with them with a zeal and a fury and a ferocity that somewhat alarmed his parents. They didn't know why he cared so much about rocks. After school, he would go to their backyard. He would crack rocks open with a hammer. He would analyze them to see what kind of rock they were. He would write them down in his journal. He would draw sketches, do all these things. On the weekends, when he had more time, he would ask his parents to take him to parks so he could find rocks in the stream. He could see, how are the rocks in the stream different from the rocks on the side of the stream? How are those different from the gravel you might find in a backyard or in a business park? And when he got the chance and his parents were feeling very generous, they would take him up into the mountains, because he lived in Colorado, you see, and they would scour the mountains for unique rocks. From giant boulders, he would take his hammer and chisel and take samples and catalog them. Well, needless to say, he loved rocks. Well, one day, Marcus's daddy, who shall be named Garbanzo, took him to a city called Glenwood Springs. Some of you might have heard of it. It's a beautiful, calm mountain town with an amusement park and hot springs and vapor caves. But most importantly for our story is the rock shop. Garbanzo had been taken to this rock shop when he was a kid. It was a rock shop called Rockface McJohnson's Rock Emporium. And Garbanzo was very excited on this trip because he took his son Marcus and he did all the fun things. The hike at Hanging Lake, the hot springs, the alpine coaster. He took him to a movie theater. They had a great time. But on their way home, the crowning accomplishment of this entire journey was the trip to McJohnson's Rock Emporium. So Garbanzo took his son Marcus and they walked inside, and instantly Marcus's jaw just went whoop all the way to the floor. His chin literally hit the floor. If there was a flock of pigeons flying about, they would have all flown into his mouth, down his throat, and digested in his stomach, although it would have taken some time to digest the beaks and the claws. Anyhow, Garbanzo whispered down into Marcus's ear, "You have $100. You can get anything you want." This made the gears inside Garbanzo's head, because we don't actually have brains in our heads. That's just kind of a myth. It's actually gears. The gears went poof, and smoke was erupting from his ears, and his eyes started going into strange circles. Anyway, he walked all around the rock shop. He saw geodes, he saw obsidian, he saw amethyst, he saw quartz, he saw gold, he saw iron pyrite, every kind of rock you could imagine. This was, after all, the finest rock shop in all the land. But finally, he came to something that really made him happy. It was an amethyst, but it was unlike any amethyst he had ever seen before. Amethysts weren't particularly rare at rock shops, but this one was so pure. The color was so beautiful. It was carved with perfection. It was smooth, and it was large. It must have been about a foot tall and maybe 4 inches wide. Garbanzo saw Marcus looking at the amethyst and said, "It's $99, you have enough." And Marcus looked at all the other rocks in the rock shop. He could get so many, but for some reason, this called to him. And he put his hand out and he touched it. And he almost felt as if there was like a little electric burst that went from the amethyst into his hand. And that both excited him and scared him, because he had never heard of a rock doing that. But he decided that this was the rock for him. So he lifted it up. Now, mind you, it was quite heavy, carried it to the checkout counter, and they paid. The lady at the checkout counter, for some reason, told him that he had a nice-shaped nose, which made him blush. I'm only telling you this because it was such an incomprehensible discussion. So they got in the car and they started their 4-hour drive home from Glenwood Springs. The whole drive home, Marcus just sat and looked at his beautiful amethyst. He held it, he rocked it back and forth as if it were a baby. He kissed it, and he dreamed about where in his bedroom it would go. He dreamed about the photos he would take of it. He dreamed about arranging all of his other rocks around it and how it would look, almost like some powerful obelisk rising from a smaller village of stones. He thought about how he would take photos. He thought about how he would draw it. He thought about telling his friends. He was so excited. Eventually, he fell asleep, and when he woke up, they were home. So he lugged his amethyst in the house, carried it upstairs into his bedroom, and put it on the shelf by his bed. And even though he was excited, he kind of forgot about it for the rest of the night because he had to spend time with his mom and his dad. He had to have dinner, do his homework, and get ready for school the next day. So the next morning when he got up, he noticed something. The amethyst looked larger. Now he wondered if it were just a trick of the light, or perhaps he had had a good night's sleep so his brain was working better. But something inside of his subconscious, or deep in his gut, told him to measure his amethyst. So he did. It was approximately 1 foot 1 inch tall. He wrote that measurement down on a sheet of paper by his shelf with the day, and then he went off to school. Now, I won't bore you with the details of his school day. It was a very regular one. But when he came home, he drew a picture of his amethyst, he colored it, and he hung it up on his wall because he loved it so much. And he went to bed. The next day he woke up, and once more he thought his amethyst looked bigger. No, he was sure it was bigger. He got out his tape measure, and surprisingly, it was 1 foot 3 inches. His amethyst had grown. He touched it, and that strange warmth he had felt was even more pronounced, and he almost felt static electricity going up his arm and dispersing through his body. He noticed something though. As he touched it, he felt good, energetic, happy. He didn't know what was happening, but he didn't want to tell his parents about it because they tended to panic. For instance, one time when he had bought a pumpkin, they wouldn't let him keep the pumpkin in his bedroom because his father Garbanzo thought the pumpkin would turn into a living jack-o'-lantern and eat him in his sleep. So he kept it a secret. Now, again, I won't bore you with his day-to-day life. The next week went by with the normal things: school, dinners, homework, playing with his friends, even a little bit of Minecraft. And on the end of the 7th day, his amethyst was 2 feet tall. And it was getting very heavy to the point that he was afraid if he let it go any farther, he wouldn't be able to lift it. So he carried it down the stairs. And his father Garbanzo looked at it and said, "Is that a different amethyst, Marcus?" Marcus merely said, "Nope, same one," and took it outside. So he found a spot in the garden where it would be covered by a tree so it wouldn't get damaged by the elements, and set it down. Because truthfully, he was afraid. What if it didn't stop growing? What if it got so big it ripped his house asunder? Or at the very worst, caused his shelf to collapse and perhaps the floor of his house to collapse? So he left it out in the garden for another several weeks. And each day, it kept growing. And the growing seemed to be exhilarating. Not only at the end of that time period was it 5 feet tall, but it had also grown from 4 inches around to about a foot around. This thing was huge. Now his mother and father couldn't help but notice this, and so he had to tell them what was going on. And so they joined him. Every day they would go out in the back of the yard to track how big the amethyst was getting, and every day it grew more and more. Before 3 months had passed, it was 12 feet tall and 3 feet around. And his neighbors had started to notice, and there was no way they could hide it. And as his neighbors noticed, they too started coming at the end of the days and the end of the weeks to track what was happening with this mysterious crystal. Well, it kept growing and growing and growing until before long, the news reporters started showing up. Police started showing up. Scientists started showing up. And Marcus and Garbanzo and Garbanzo's wife, Malashitosh, were very much hoping to get some sort of explanation for what was going on. This had to just be some simple chemical reaction or something that had happened somewhere else on the world before, but it hadn't. everyone was perplexed, confused. They didn't know what was happening. And so time kept passing. There was the fall, and the winter, and the spring. And when the season had passed, the amethyst was now 100 feet tall and 20 feet wide. It was like a massive tree. It was beautiful. The sun shone through it, and at night, it even seemed to have a small glow. This is when Marcus became very thankful he put it at the very end of their large yard, because it was getting larger and larger. It would take a very long time before it got close to their house, but he became getting concerned. That night, though, something happened that rather shocked Marcus, and he showed his father Garbanzo this. They found a newspaper article about something else similar happening on the other side of the world. It wasn't an amethyst. It was some sort of dark obsidian, but it too appeared to be inexplicably growing. But when people touched this obsidian, they felt cold, and they felt shocked, and they almost felt a sense of foreboding. Some would say perhaps even terror. And the scientists on this other side of the world too were perplexed. They didn't know at the time what it meant, but Marcus suspected it was significant. Once again, the seasons passed, and before long, the amethyst was 200 feet tall and 45 feet wide. And this is when they noticed something changing. For out of the base of the amethyst were sprouting two separate protuberances. They almost looked like legs. And when Marcus looked up to the very top, which he had to use binoculars to do now, he could see two other protuberances expressing themselves from the body of the amethyst. They almost looked like arms. Now Marcus knew this was an impossibility. There is no way that a crystal could be growing arms and legs. But still, he observed it carefully over the next weeks and months. And lo and behold, eventually, the amethyst crystal grew up so the bottom was no longer on the ground. The two protuberances, or legs, which now they were unmistakably becoming, held it up, and these legs grew thicker and taller and stronger. The arms grew out. They had joints, and eventually they had hands with fingers. And by the time the legs and arms were fully grown, the amethyst crystal was now 500 feet high. This couldn't be hidden from the world anymore, nor could the changes in the strange obsidian crystal across the world be hidden. But it grew differently. It started growing horizontally. It grew 9 legs. It grew a giant stinger at the back, which resembled a scorpion. It had pincer claws on the front, and it grew stalky, bulbous eyes that stroke fear in the hearts of any who saw it. Well, as the weeks and months again progressed, the amethyst crystal grew a head, and eyes, and a mouth. And there was people coming to see it every day. Garbanzo and Marcus's wife had to charge money to let people come see it because their yard was getting so trampled. And one day, in the fall, as there was a beautiful golden sun shining down and the golden leaves were drifting gently off the maple tree, the amethyst moved. It opened its eyes. It spoke. "Where is it?" is all it could say. Nobody knew how to answer this question. They all just looked up at it in surprise. And then it closed its eyes, and its head seemed to loll down as it fell asleep. Well, they didn't know this at the time, but the obsidian creature on the other side of the earth had started to move. It clacked around on its many legs, but instead of saying, "Where is it?" it chopped 2 people in half with its giant pincers and ate them, and then went back into slumber. Now, as you can imagine, this terrified many people on the other side of the planet. But Marcus and Garbanzo weren't concerned with that. They were concerned every day their amethyst woke up. "Where is it?" and then fell back asleep. But it was still growing. It was starting to glow deeply. It had a halo of energy about it, and the warmth and wellness it radiated seemed to encourage and heal people all around it. Finally, one day the amethyst said, "Where is it?" twice, before going back to sleep. And it woke up and said, "Where is it? I feel it." And then it looked around at all the people down below. "Who are you?" Well, Marcus reasoned that since it technically was his amethyst, he should be the one to speak. So he got a megaphone and he said, "My name is Marcus. I found you in a shop. Who are you looking for?" The amethyst creature seemed to be confused for a moment. And then he said, "The great nemesis, the dark one. I must stop him. Where is it?" Then he fell asleep. Marcus thought about that the whole night. And somewhere in the back of his heart, he knew. So he and his father once more went to the internet and started researching what had happened with the obsidian creature, the obsidian crystal on the other side of the planet. And they were shocked what they had read. This creature had chopped 2 more people in half. It had destroyed homes. It had eaten a bunch of cows. The army of this country had moved in and tried to blast it with tanks, but whenever they tried to fire something at it, a glow seemed to encompass the entire creature, and the projectile would just dissipate into nothingness, almost if it had just been turned into dust. They were evacuating the area around the creature because it too was getting bigger. Marcus knew what this meant. So the next day, when the amethyst awoke and said, "Where is it?" Marcus yelled up with his megaphone, "It's not far from the Great Pyramids. That's where it is. Are you looking for the obsidian?" And the amethyst creature seemed to roar, a guttural, deep rumbling that shook the houses around him. "The great enemy. Yes, you must take me to him." Marcus looked up at the creature with his megaphone and said, "I would help you, but how? I can't move you. There's nothing that can move you." And surprisingly enough, the amethyst got down on one knee and said, "Come with me, guide me, show me." Marcus looked at his parents. His dad seemed to shrug. His mother was crying because she knew what was going to happen. And just like that, Marcus climbed onto the creature's back. "Guide me." Well, Marcus had his phone, and so he set his navigation system for Egypt, and he told the amethyst creature where to walk. Now, fortunately, this amethyst, this giant amethyst beast, for lack of a better term, was conscientious, and it did its best not to smash houses or cars. It did leave massive potholes in roads. It did ruin the flow of some rivers. It accidentally broke a bridge, but it eventually made it to the coast of the United States without harming any person or animal. And then, believe it or not, it started walking upon the ocean. It would take a step, and the ocean would crystallize underneath it. And it would take another step, and the same thing would happen with the other foot, and the crystals would just disappear. And so it walked, and it walked, and it walked. Now, the strange thing was, Marcus's phone did not seem to need to be charged. It must be that energy that was radiating off the amethyst creature that was charging it. Well, eventually, they got to Egypt, because Marcus could see in the distance the Great Pyramids, and he could see a giant, terrifying scorpion. It was taking its massive pincers, smashing the pyramids to shred. There were helicopters shooting missiles at it, which just seemed to evaporate into nothingness. It was a great battle, but Marcus could see the humans had no chance, and he knew what was going to happen. "There it is," he whispered to the amethyst creature. "The great enemy. Yes, now we must destroy it." "We?" Marcus said. The amethyst creature grumbled. "Well, I can't destroy it, but I can hold it for you. Take this." And out of its shoulder sprouted an amethyst sword that was glowing brightly, fiercely, almost as if there was a sun inside of it. Marcus grabbed it, and he felt the energy suffuse his body. He had never felt this powerful, this alert, this fast. "I will hold it down. You must stab it in the back of the neck, right in its obsidian heart, to defeat it. I am not able to do this, for as you can see, the blade is much too small for me." Marcus felt his heart pound. He felt himself sweat. But oddly, he knew he could do this. He knew he had been born to do this. This was his time. And so he clung to the back of the amethyst creature's neck as hard as he could, and the amethyst creature started running towards the obsidian beast so hard its footsteps were smashing the ground. The Great Pyramids were shaking, and the army helicopters and tanks and jets that were nearby immediately evacuated because they could sense what was happening. The amethyst creature started with a massive blow to the head of the scorpion, the obsidian scorpion. It seemed to reel and to fall, but then it counterattacked with its massive stinger, smashing in and knocking off bits of obsidian. Marcus realized this was not going to be so easy. The two beasts battled. They exchanged blows. The amethyst creature, the amethyst giant, was knocked down. The scorpion jumped on top of it, but at the last moment, the amethyst giant raised a knee and shot the scorpion into the air. This went on for a much longer time than you would have expected. And somehow, Marcus was okay. He didn't know if the sword protected him, if the amethyst creature, the warmth radiating from it somehow protected him, but he survived. And then the moment came. The amethyst giant grabbed the scorpion's stinger and punched it so hard, the piercing tip flew off and smashed into the Great Pyramid, leaving a giant dent. Well, at that moment, Marcus jumped onto the arm of the amethyst giant, slid down it, slid down the tail onto the back of the obsidian beast. He ran to the base of the neck, took his sword, and smashed it in as deeply as he could. But nothing happened. The beast started roiling and shaking and writhing around, and it was all Marcus could do just to hold on. The obsidian giant grabbed the body of the scorpion and sat on its head, and the scorpion was swinging and thrashing around, but Marcus managed to get up a little higher where he could see a soft glow strobing underneath the obsidian scorpion's skin. He stabbed it with his sword, and just like that, there was a deep sound, like the rumbling of the deepest bass you had ever heard, and then whoo, and the light was gone. And suddenly, the obsidian scorpion was just obsidian. But much to his dismay, the amethyst giant was just amethyst. The warmth was gone. But Marcus noticed the amethyst in his hand was still glowing, but surprisingly, it transformed quickly. It transformed into an amethyst crystal, like the one he had just gotten that first day in the rock shop. Well, he didn't have too much time to think about it. He put it into his backpack, and as quickly as he could, he went to the American embassy in Egypt. Everyone had watched what had happened, and they had celebrated him as a hero. He got a first-class flight home, and when he got there, his parents gave him as much Dairy Queen as he wanted. And the state and the president gave him $1 billion for basically saving the world, as far as they could tell. Those giants could have kept growing and growing until they wiped out the entire planet. That was all good, and he enjoyed his little bout of fame, but after a while, it became exhausting, and he just wanted to go back to regular life. So he and his parents changed their names. His name was no longer Marcus. He changed his name to Alden, and his daddy Garbanzo changed his name to Jeffrey, and they moved to a new town and started a new life. But down in his crawl space, he kept that amethyst crystal, because if that crystal was still there, was there a chance the obsidian monster might ever come back? He didn't know. He hoped not, but he held on to it just in case one day it did. Well, Alden, I hoped you enjoyed this story. I wanted to tell something random and fun and epic. So send me your review on Skype of whether this was a 1 or 10. Or alternatively, those poor unfortunate souls of you who have stumbled upon this insanity, this depravity, this disgustingness, leave me a thumbs up if you liked it. Or in the comments, tell me how ugly I am if you didn't like it. Thank you for watching. Alden, you are loved more than I can express. Good night.